In this book, One in a Million, which tells the story of the Billy Graham Crusades as part of Mission England in 1984, the author writes these words. Billy Graham has always kept his message simple and basic. He attracts critics, mostly academic theologians, who accuse him of omitting half the facts. But he appeals to many people who are trying to find their way through the thick jungle of life's hard questions, and who need an earth mover to clear a path rather than a guidebook to describe the tropical trees they keep walking into. Billy Graham, the late Reverend Dr. Billy Graham, always kept his message basic and simple. And the late Apostle Peter, that great evangelist of the early church, kept his message basic and simple too. And like Billy Graham, Peter did not preach religion. Peter did not preach a religious system. Peter did not even preach a creed. But what Peter did preach was a living person, the person of God's own Son, and the work which he accomplished for guilty men and women. Put simply, Peter preached the gospel. Peter preached the mighty acts of God and what God had done in and through his Son for the salvation of precious souls, for the salvation of men and women. Acts chapter 2, verse 36 is a small but significant verse where we read, therefore, and that verse is there for a reason, therefore let all Israel be assured of this, God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, note the words, this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. Lord and Christ. Peter preached the good news. Peter preached about a person. Peter preached about Jesus Christ and the redemptive work of Jesus Christ on the cross. He preached his incarnation. Look at verse 22 in the words, Jesus of Nazareth was a man. He was the God-man, the man who was accredited by God. Now that phrase, accredited by God, is a phrase which indicates and validates his deity. Peter preached in his message his incarnation, that being the incarnation of Jesus Christ. However, Peter also preached his crucifixion, verse 23, which declares divine sovereignty and human responsibility, and which tells us that the Lord was born to die for a purpose. Peter, in his first letter, and the third chapter of that first letter, in the 18th verse, alludes to that. He preached his crucifixion, that being the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Not only did he preach his incarnation and preach his crucifixion as part of his message, but Peter also preached his resurrection. Oh, if there were no resurrection, we alone could not be saved. This is the game changer. The resurrection changes everything. And Peter preached the resurrection. We preach Christ crucified, risen, and exalted. Peter showed, as we alluded to earlier on in our reflections this week, as we thought about the Messiah and how Peter drew on the prophet Joel and on the psalmist David, Peter showed that this was predicted in the Old Testament, verses 25 to 28. And this was always the great emphasis of apostolic teaching and preaching. Psalm 16, verses 8 to 11. Peter also preached his ascension. You see, the resurrection was not the end. Jesus rose from the dead, and then Jesus ascended back into heaven, implied in verse 33. And Peter also preached his exaltation, verses 33 and 36. What a triumphant conclusion to a great sermon. Oh, if all my sermons were as great as Peter's. He preached his exaltation. Thank God that we are able to proclaim a living and a glorious Lord, one who not only died, one who not only rose again, one who not only ascended and is seated at the right hand of the Father, but one who one day, very soon I believe, will come again. This is the one we preach. We preach Christ crucified, risen, and exalted. And that is what Peter would have said. We preach Christ crucified, risen, and exalted. Peter's message was earthed in a person, in the person of Jesus Christ. He preached his incarnation. He preached his crucifixion. He preached of his resurrection. He preached of his ascension. And he preached of his exaltation. What a great sermon Peter preached. Why don't you go and read that sermon again and be excited by what Peter preached on the day of Pentecost? It was a great sermon.